What if I told you that one of the oldest, loudest, and most dramatic stories humanity keeps telling was not just a bedtime tale, but a record of real events? You probably think myths are fantasies wrapped in poetry, but stay with me because this one might change how you see the past. Picture this: a heap of gleaming gold is dragged from a trench. A whisper rises. The name of a king who may or may not have existed that moment happened more than a century ago, and the man behind it loved headlines almost as much as truth. What he uncovered was dazzling enough to fill museums, but messy enough to spark an argument that still rages today. By the end of this story, you will know what was discovered, who lied, why it matters, and whether the Iliad is history or brilliant fiction. Before we dive deeper, a quick favor. If you want more myth investigations like this, tap the like button and subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. I love seeing the myth map of the world light up. Now let's set the stage. The myth itself is simple. A prince steals a woman, a war consumes cities. Heroes clash and a clever trick wins the day. Homer sang it in long lines, and generations repeated it until names like Troy, Priam, and Achilles felt like family. But was any of it real for centuries? Most scholars shrugged and said no, calling it poetry, not history. Everything changed in the 1870s when a German businessman with the flair of a showman arrived at a hill in northwest Turkey. He picked the spot because earlier travelers had noticed strange ruins there and because a line in Homer felt like a clue. He hired workers, dug furiously, and uncovered walls beneath walls. A burned city, a hidden hoard of treasure, he declared it. The treasure of Priam, the world gasped. Here was the danger. Gold glittering in dirt seemed to answer a poem. The man who found it was not just an excavator, but a character in the story. He told reporters he had proved Homer true. He smuggled artifacts across borders. He wept over the treasure, claiming it belonged to Priam himself. The headlines loved him. But the details told another story. He bulldozed through layers, mixed centuries together, and destroyed evidence forever. That is the first fact to remember. Troy was not one city, but many, 9 or 10, stacked atop each other, each destroyed, rebuilt, lived in again. You could find Bronze Age gold and call it Trojan, even if it came from a completely different century. That is exactly what happened. The treasure was real, but the timing was wrong. And still more evidence emerged. The region around the hill contained ruins, records, and tablets. The Hittite Empire wrote of places and people that sounded oddly familiar. They mentioned Wailusa and Ahiawa, names that echo Ilias and the Achaeans. If true, then powerful neighbors were writing about conflicts in the same era that Homer later set his war. But is that enough? A treasure here, a name there. We still need bones, burnt houses, and broken walls. And we have them. Archaeologists later uncovered Troy's 7 layer, with collapsed fortifications and charred ruins. Its destruction lined up with the late Bronze Age. When Greece's palaces fell, when Egypt fought sea raiders, when trade routes shattered, the evidence was there. A city ended in fire. And the soil whispered more than walls. Charred barley grains, arrowheads buried in rubble, bent spear points, melted beads of glass, smashed pottery, all spoke of sudden violent change. A city did not fade away here, it was destroyed. Not quite the 10-year siege of Homer, but close enough to nudge myth toward history. But here's the catch. The man who first shouted treasure to the world had wrecked as much as he revealed. His careless digging mixed timelines. His hunger for headlines created confusion. But this too is part of the story. The first voices to shout discovery are not always the ones who tell. The truth later, archaeologists returned with better tools and steadier hands. And slowly, the picture sharpened. And then came the biggest twist. The most important find was not gold, but clay. A tablet scratched with writing in a forgotten script sat in a museum drawer. When it was translated, it mentioned Wailusa, a place tangled in conflicts, with groups that sounded suspiciously like the Mycenaeans. Suddenly, the story of Troy moved from impossible myth to messy human politics. Of course, the debates never stopped. Some historians argued Wailusa was a coincidence. Others said the texts were about trade, not war, but when you put it all together, a pattern forms. Burnt walls, a city in ashes, foreign records naming it. This is not pure invention, something happened here. And we can even glimpse the culture in small details. A silver amulet sailors carried to ward off drowning turned up in the ruins. It showed Troy's ties to vast trade networks. This was not an isolated town, but a hub on the edge of great powers. Its destruction would have rippled far beyond its walls. A war here could have been everyone's crisis. So what do we have so far? A stack of cities, a burned layer at the right time records, naming the place a sailor's charm, a child's toy rattle shaped like a pig found in the ashes. These fragments whisper that Troy was real. Not exactly Homer's Troy, but not fantasy either. And here's the cliffhanger. Homer's war may not have unfolded as written, but the ground itself testifies to fire, destruction, and conflict. In the next section, we will push further. We will follow the timeline layer by layer, test the treasure with modern science, and even pull DNA from ancient bones. We will ask who lived in Troy, what destroyed it, and whether Homer preserved history or reshaped memory into poetry. We ended with the question hanging in the air. Was Homer recording history or spinning poetry so rich it tricked later readers into believing it must have been real? To answer that, we need to drag the story through the full gauntlet of evidence, from the bones in the ground to the tablets in foreign archives to the tools of modern science. First, the timeline archaeologists now know the hill of Hisarlik. The site, widely accepted as Troy, has 9 major layers of occupation. Each city was built on the ruins of the last after destruction, decay, or fire. The most important for our story is Troy Savannah, a settlement that ended violently around 1200 BCE. This date sits squarely in the Late Bronze Age, the same era when Mycenaean palaces in Greece collapsed, when Egypt fought mysterious invaders it called the Sea Peoples, and when trade networks shattered across the Mediterranean. If you wanted a perfect storm for myth to grow from real conflict, this was it. But here comes the twist that still makes headlines. The treasure that Heinrich Schliemann paraded as proof of Priam's wealth did not come from Troy Savannah at all. It came from a much earlier layer, centuries before the supposed Trojan War. His sloppy digging and hunger for attention fused the wrong treasure with the right. Myth, the gold was real, but the connection was fake. The truth was far messier than the headlines. So was it all fraud? Not exactly. The artifacts were genuine, and the site itself was rich in evidence of destruction and wealth. The era was in pinning every object to one dramatic night in Homer's tale. This is where myth and history blur together. Real events are dressed up in story, and story loops back to change how we see the events. Modern science has sharpened that picture in ways Schliemann could never imagine. Radiocarbon dating fixes the destruction layer of Troy Savannah. More securely, pottery analysis compares styles with finds across Greece and Anatolia. Chemical testing of metal reveals long-distance trade routes stretching from Anatolia to Cyprus to the Aegean. This was not a backwater town. It was plugged into a vast network of exchange and power. That wealth explains why a war here could matter, enough to survive in memory for centuries. And then there is the evidence hidden in bones. Scientists have pulled fragments of DNA from ancient remains at the site. The genetic profile shows a mix of local Anatolian ancestry with traits linked to populations from the Greek world. Troy was a borderland, a crossroads of cultures, not just another town on the edge of Asia Minor. That detail alone makes the Homeric image of Greeks clashing with Trojans more believable. A multicultural city stood in the path of empires and was eventually destroyed. Now add to that the written evidence. The archives of the Hittite Empire record treaties, conflicts, and alliances with a place called Wailusa, which many scholars believe is the same city. Homer called Ilias. One document even mentions a ruler named Alexandru, a name strikingly close to Alexandrus, another name for Paris, the prince who stole Helen. The coincidences are eerie. You would not expect foreign scribes to write names that mirror Homer's cast if the memory of a city and its conflicts did not already exist in the region. Still, skeptics push back. They argue that Homer composed his epics centuries after any real war. Oral tradition bends truth like a reed in the wind. They say the archaeology shows destruction, but not necessarily the decade-long siege of legend. And they are right. To be cautious, the god speeches and dramatic duels are not history. They are the embroidery of poetry, but oral traditions can preserve kernels of truth far longer than you might expect. Cultures retell stories of trauma for generations, wrapping them in myth, but never letting the scar vanish completely. So what is the scar here? It is the burned city of Troy Savannah, the smashed walls and collapsed houses, the weapons in the rubble, the foreign goods in the ruins. The evidence points to a violent end at the very moment when the eastern Mediterranean world was unraveling. Achilles, Hector, and Helen may be embellishments, but the fire in the soil is real. Archaeology even gives us details. Homer never mentioned the city had underground cisterns to store water in case of siege. Massive fortifications ringed the settlement. This was no village, but a stronghold designed to withstand attack. That means conflict was not just possible, it was expected. And then there are the small human touches, like the clay rattle shaped like a pig found in the debris. It belonged to a child who once played in the streets of a city that would become legend. Put it all together, and the verdict looks like this. A war probably happened. Troy was real. It stood at a strategic crossroads of trade and power. It was burned in the right era. Foreign empires recorded its name. Its walls were strong and its culture diverse. That is the yes. The no is that Homer's epic wrapped the story in God's hero speeches and timelines stretched for dramatic effect. But here is the real lesson. Myths are not empty. They are echoes of memory. Distorted through generations, they preserve scars, even when they clothe them in fantasy. The Trojan War, as Homer told it, may not be literal truth, but it carries the outline of a real conflict. The Iliad is both art and history at the same time, and this matters for more than curiosity. Myths like Troy gave cultures identity and pride. For Greeks, the Trojan War was their foundation epic, a shared story that bound them together. Modern archaeology works in reverse. It takes the myth apart and searches for the bones hidden beneath. And in the case of Troy, those bones are real ash, real walls, real treasures. So never dismiss a myth as pure invention. The tale of Troy turned out to be a blend of memory and imagination. A burned city, a smuggled treasure, a name etched in clay, all whisper that something happened 3,000 years ago. We may never know the full truth, but the whispers themselves are proof that myth and history are forever tangled. So the next time you hear an epic tale, ask yourself, could this be one of those myths that turned out to be true? Could the scar of a real event still echo in the poetry we repeat? The answer may never be final, but the hunt for truth is the real adventure, and that adventure is far from over.